This is Chris Vogler. I'm the author of The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structure for Writers, and also Memo from the Story Department, Secrets of Structure and Character. And you're listening to Genretainment.
And here are your hosts, Marks and Julie.
Hello everyone, this is Genretainment, and we're your hosts, Marks
and Julie. And on today's episode, we're chatting with author J. Thorn. He's published over 2 million words and has sold more than 185,000 books worldwide.
He's also the co-creator of the 3-Story Method, the Story Rubric, the Nonfic Rubric, and co-hosts his own podcast. It was exciting to finally get to have Jay on the show. He's an author that I've been following for years now.
We had a great chat with him about all of his projects. We also chatted about the advantages of co-writing, writing short stories, writing post-apocalyptic fiction, and why having grit is so important as an author.
Before we get into this episode's interview, I do want to mention again an anthology I had the honor of taking part of recently. My new science fiction comedy short story can be found in the anthology Like Sunshine After Rain. In the show notes, you can find a link to the cover reveal page, which has more information and pre-order links if you're interested. The book is filled with short stories, poems, and essays.
And all the proceeds benefit the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, a great cause to support.
Yes, and thanks to Heidi Ruby Miller for editing and organizing the anthology. She'll be on the show in the very near future.
But for now, let's get to our interview with J. Thorn.
Well, welcome to the show, Jay.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Super excited to have you on. You've been one of those authors for me that has been like a virtual mentor of sorts, sort of like Joanna Penn and Michael Ron. So we're really excited to have you on here to kind of pick your brain a little bit about being an indie author. And before we start discussing your many different projects, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience with how you first got started with this writing career?
How I first got started. I'm not one of those writers who was like, oh, I always knew I wanted to be a writer from the time I was 4. Like, I wish I had that kind of direction in life.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that there's someone besides me out there like that.
Yeah, it didn't. I mean, when I look back now, I see that writing and more generally storytelling has been a big part of my life and continues to be. But being a novelist was not even on the radar until I was well into my 30s. So, I started. I go way back. I started as a dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons at cool. 11 and 12 years old, and I really loved playing that game, but only if I could be the DM because
that's good storytelling training. Yeah,
that's right. I wanted to be the one in charge of the story, and so that's kind of where it started. And then in college, I wrote op-ed pieces for the school newspaper. That was back when they had these long pieces of paper with black print on them, and they had news on them, and you would read them.
Oh, the best part, I love, you probably are the same as me, like these young whippersnappers these days, they don't understand, like, you had to worry about the square inch and the amount, and then I loved the old light table with the hot wax and the X-Acto knife, and you'd actually piece it together and make this Frankenstein page that you would then take down to the print shop in your school.
Yeah.
And
you
had to care about the content, but you had to know how to cut it down to fit in a certain square inch fitting,
Yeah. It's hard to believe. I was writing at the University of Pittsburgh in the late 80s, and I remember the first day they moved desktop computers into the office for the newspaper to write them on computer. Like it's just, I don't know, it feels like another lifetime ago. And so like, and I can kind of trace that storytelling gene all the way through my life. I've been in bands since I was 18 years old. There's a lot of storytelling involved with songwriting. And then eventually, I read Stephen King's On Writing, and I figured, okay, I've got this all figured out now. I'll just become the next Stephen King. And that was the beginning of my writing career.
How's that going?
I didn't quite get there.
Hey, you made it to our show. I call it a success.
Yeah, take that, King.
Yeah, he hasn't
been on our show, so as far as I'm concerned, you are up there above him.
Right on.
That's cool that you started with role-playing games. I didn't realize that. That's kind of how I started too, with Dungeons & Dragons.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I honestly can't claim that because I hadn't done any role-playing until I met Mark's.
Oh.
I haven't done the Game Master. I don't think that would really be my strong suit. I like playing kick-ass characters.
Yeah.
I like playing the ones that kick ass and usually don't bother to take names.
Yep.
You're right. High dice rolls. That's all that matters.
So, of course, you write fiction. You also do nonfiction and teach. One thing you came out with a system that you co-created called the 3-story method. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit more about that method and how it compares to maybe some other popular methods that they've heard of?
Yeah, sure. It's been almost a year since that book came out, and it's a lot's happened in the past year. It feels like a lot longer than that.
Yeah.
But really, the idea, I'm a certified story grid editor. I was trained in the first class by Sean Coyne back in 2017.
And that is not easy to get. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was new at the time, and a bit of a risk for many reasons. But I've always been a story nerd. I've always been. I constantly read craft books, and your skill set's an evolution. Like you're always growing, you're always learning. At least that's how I see it. And Zach Bohannon, my partner in crime, we were running these author events, world building weekends, and authors on a train, and doing these really cool things. And we were trying to help people create a framework for writing stories. And what we found we were doing was we were pulling bits and pieces of all these methodologies. So, Save the Cat and the Hero's Journey and the Snowflake Method and Story Grid. And yet we were kind of pulling it together into our own sort of formula. And I think this is how most story methodologies start. They start by pulling bits and pieces and elements from others. And so Zach said, well, we really need to codify this. And I was like, well, then we should probably write a book about it. That would make sense. So I spent months going back through, and I read literally dozens of craft books and pulling out elements. And if you read 3-Story Method, you'll know that it really is this conglomeration of all these different methodologies. And my uber goal, which is what I think sets my book apart from other craft books, is my aim was simplicity from the beginning. I wanted something that was incredibly simplistic, efficient, and easy to understand, but would take a lifetime to master. And so what I boil 3-Story Method down to is what we call the 3 C's. And those are the 3 basic components of any story: the beginning, the middle, and the end. And we label those as the conflict, the choice, and the consequence. So whether you're telling a story in a bar to a bunch of friends, or you're writing a novel, or you're writing a sales email, if you're telling a story, by just the DNA of storytelling, you have those 3 elements in it. So we try and come up with the initial conflict, which is the event that starts the story, that pushes us out of the status quo, or our protagonist out of the status quo. We force that protagonist to make a choice. The harder the choice, the better the story is. And then the consequence is the result of that choice. And it sounds super easy and super simple, but it gives you a framework to work from. And that really is the core of 3-Story Method.
I like that.
I think it's great. Yeah, sometimes the story methods out there, they get so complex.
Oh, yeah.
Have so much terminology that it can get really overwhelming, be intimidating just by itself. And I like how you build upon existing methodologies, and you also talk about them too. You don't just say I made it up out of thin air,
Yeah. It's based on
right.
knowledge and information.
What?
This is 2021. I mean, we have passed the era of information a long time ago.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lineage too. Joseph Campbell came out, he looked at it from a more academic standpoint and looked at sort of the cultural implications of storytelling and mythology and religion. And then you had Christopher Vogler, who came along and sort of adapted that to more of a modern form of storytelling. And then you had Robert McKee, who took Vogler's work and kind of created his own version of storytelling. And then you had Sean Coyne, who was a mentor of McKee, create Story Grid. And then you have me, who is a mentor of Sean Coyne with 3-Story Method. So you're right. You're not going to come up with this brand new original storytelling idea. And you could even argue that Campbell went all the way back to Aristotle, and who knows who Aristotle got it from. But you can follow it, and so it's not about coming up with an original idea. It's coming up with an original approach to an idea that everyone already recognizes.
Awesome. And there's a book and a workbook out right now, right?
Yeah, we created both a book and a workbook. So The workbook is more out of convenience. There's a free download in the back of the book. You can download a Word or PDF document and print out the worksheets if you want. The workbook is nice because what we've done is we've replicated the scene worksheet 80 or 90 times so that if you're mapping out, say, a whole novel, or you're developing a whole novel, you can just buy one workbook. And we price the workbooks at cost, so we don't make anything from the workbook. They're a few dollars. We wanted to make them kind of disposable so that people wouldn't make them precious. Like, I know a lot of times I see these wonderful journals out there and I want to get them and I think I'd never use it because it's too nice.
Yeah.
So I didn't want that. Like, we wanted it to be a disposable mindset, and that, like, yeah, you can grab a workbook for every project that you have and it's bound and all in one place.
Cool. Kind of as an extension to that, you have the Story Rubric that you came out with for fiction and nonfiction, which I think is, so I have an MFA that I got recently. And one of the most useful things I've learned when taking my teaching classes was how to create rubrics for classes.
Right.
And I guess I had a little bit of experience with rubrics because I worked for a script analysis company that had one for us, I guess, to make sure we were all kind of doing the same standard.
I forgot you did that.
Yeah. And so, I love when I saw this tool that you came out with, and it just kind of one of those head-slapping moment things like, duh, why didn't somebody do this before? What's really cool about it, too, is that you allow people to be able to submit, to add to it, too, which I hope to do someday when I get a chance here, or try to. Can you tell us a little bit more about that Story Rubric and why you did that?
Yeah, that was another natural evolution. I have a master's degree in education, and I taught for 23 or 24 years. And I taught at every level. I taught, my favorite saying is I taught kindergartners how to read and graduate students how to write and everything in between. And one of the things that I learned probably in the early 90s was there was this assessment movement in education, and it was about, how do we make assessments that are more meaningful? We're all familiar with standardized testing and bubble sheets and multiple choice tests. But those
which
don't really
do not
reflect
measure
learning.
how well someone has learned.
That's right. They don't measure that at all, really. There was a trend in education, and then in the early 2000s, it became more solidified, and we were developing a lot of rubrics. And so the history department where I was teaching, we kind of came up with these different rubrics that would be the same for all classes. Because another problem we had was if you had, Mrs. Jones' history class versus Mr. Smith's history class, even though they're teaching the same content, the expectations could be radically different, and students know that. They're smart enough to figure that out. So a rubric is a nice way of having consistent assessment measurements. And so I was working, fast forward a few decades, and now I'm working with clients and doing developmental editing, and I was sort of following the traditional editorial letter, which I would write up all the things that the author needed to take a look at or revise or improve. Mm-hmm. And it was just a wall of text. And I was like, this feels really antiquated. Like an editorial letter just feels like something that they used 40 years ago. And I had this light bulb moment of like, well, what if I made a rubric? And then I used the rubric to assess the manuscript. This way, the author wouldn't have to wade through thousands and thousands of words of this editorial letter, and they could zero in on certain aspects of their manuscript. The other thing that was great about it, about a rubric, is that you have these gradients, right? So you can look at one side of the rubric, which would be considered like if you're not meeting expectations or it's completely not working, and all the way to the other side is excellence. And then you have this scale in between. So you can get very specific and granular with your feedback as an editor. So I tried it out with a few clients. I said, hey, in addition to how I normally work with you, check out this rubric. Let me know what you think of this. They were like, oh my God, you have to do this. Like, this is so helpful. And so I was talking to my friend Chris, who I run the Author Success Mastermind with, and I said, I don't really know what to do with this. Like, I don't know if I should write a book, or I'm like, I really don't want to build a course. I kind of don't want to write a book, but like, it was like a rubric. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, part of me had like the scarcity mindset. And I'm like, what if someone takes it? And she's like, well, so what if someone takes it? And then I made this other connection that I had with the business model canvas, which Alex Osterwalder created. He put that in Creative Commons licensing. He basically says anyone can take the business model canvas and adapt it and revise it and use it as long as you give him credit as being the one who created it. And I was like, that's it. Yeah. So that's what I did. I took the rubrics, I put Creative Commons licensing on them, which means anyone can use them for anything, commercial purposes. You can adapt it, change it, The only thing I ask is that you put a proper citation at the bottom that I have on the form that credits me and links back to both Story Rubric and Nonfic Rubric, and otherwise have at it. Use it for what it's worth. So that's been my approach with the rubrics.
That's really
very
cool.
It's kind of like the open gaming license with
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's open sourced, and I'm really encouraging people to come up with variations and send them to me. I'll put them on the main page, almost like an archive. But if they don't want to, they can print them out and use them as is. And hopefully it just helps people to make better stories. I think the rubrics are really powerful, and however they help you, great.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to try once a little more downtime to see if I can add something.
I'm sorry. Every time he says when I have a little downtime, I laugh because he always makes sure he never has any downtime somehow.
Whatever.
I know how that goes.
Another thing that's really interesting is you have a nonfic. I don't know why I would say that.
You're trying to say nonfiction?
Nonfiction. Story Rubric. Why did you decide to do a nonfiction version of that?
Well, I write a lot of nonfiction. I had to do clients who write nonfiction as well, and it seemed like a no-brainer. Like once I had the Story Rubric done, I'm like, well, I could pretty easy, like in a day or two, I could I could adapt this to a nonfiction rubric, and why not? It's kind of two sides of the same coin. So, once Story Rubric was done, that was kind of a no-brainer.
I would imagine it would be somewhat helpful because for a lot of people who have gone through the academic side of things, it would be so easy to say, I'm writing a nonfiction book, but basically write like a really, really, really long, extensive research paper. And that's not exactly going to be the most user-friendly book for the average person.
Right.
I mean, that might be your inclination because of training, right? Like you're just cranking out this really long research paper, but that's not necessarily what a lot of people are going to want to read.
Not
No.
You also co-host or have co-hosted a number of different podcasts over the years. For example, you used to co-host The Writer's Well with Rachel Herron, who actually got to meet at our university. She was one of the speakers there.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your current podcasts that are out, like Writers Inc., I think is one of them.
Yeah, I have two writing podcasts out now. The one is relatively new. Writers Inc. is the one I started, I'm trying to think of time now, how long it's been. Would have been the fall of 19, I guess, with J.D. Barker. Mm-hmm. So I met J.D. Barker at Thriller Fest in New York City in the summer of 2019. I pitched him a podcast idea, and he immediately said no. and I was like, that's totally cool. I understand. Like I usually understand that in the world of creativity, 9 of 10 of your projects or ideas are always going to fail. So I just accept that that's going to happen. And then every once in a while, one of them kind of pops up and surprises you. So I had a back and forth with JD, and he really wanted to improve his public speaking and his presentation skills. So he thought, why not? We'll give this a shot. So we decided on doing an interview format podcast, interviewing writers. It's called Writers Inc., a little play on words there, INK. But the writers are not just novelists. So we interview screenwriters and nonfiction writers, fiction writers. We've had a wide variety of guests. JD is very well connected in the industry, so we've been able to get on folks like James Patterson and Blake Crouch, and recently we had Matthew McConaughey on for his latest book tour. So it's been a really wonderful experience for me. As I'm sure you two know, when you do an interview podcast, you almost get like a private mentoring session with the person you're talking to. So it's been a lot of fun. The listeners have responded well to it, and we're up to episode 70 or 71 now, something like that. Zach has recently joined us sort of full time now, so now Zach is part of that podcast. Yeah, and that's been great. And then the other one I just started more recently with Chris Kane is the Author Success Mastermind podcast. That is much like the Writer's Well, when I was doing with Rachel, and that we're taking a question from our writer community and sort of going deep on it in a podcast format.
Cool. Yeah, I've listened to both of those. It was really good. Matthew McConaughey interview was quite good.
Thanks. It was fun.
I'm sure it was all right.
Well,
I couldn't help it. I tried so hard. I was like, don't do it. It's a requisite.
It's funny you mention that because I went back and forth on that. I wanted to ask him to do it, but at the same time I didn't. I didn't because I know, like, I'm sure he gets that, like, people yelling at him on the street, like, all the time. And I didn't want to be that guy. But at the same time, I wanted to hear it.
Right. And you know
So
what?
I
My
opted
feeling
not to.
is, anybody in a situation like his, they should just be grateful people remember it and know who you are and are excited to hear you say it or to say it to you. Because if they'd, he'd probably be more upset if people had forgotten about him.
Yeah, and I get the sense, I mean, I obviously don't know him other than the interview, but like I get the sense that he is very appreciative of his success and his fame, and that he's not the kind of person who would get upset if someone, said that to him on the street.
Yeah.
Yep. You've also done a lot of co-writing over the years, and I think you co-wrote maybe 2 different books in co-writing, I think, because I think you did one with Joanna Penn, another one with Zach, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So you co-wrote a fiction novel with Joanna Penn, Risen Gods, which was a really great book. And in New Zealand, I think it was, right? I'm pretty
Correct.
Sure. And
yeah.
Mythology. And I thought that Authors on a Train project is great. The one you co-wrote with Joanna Penn and I'm blinking now, Lindsay Broker and Zach, I believe, with American Demon Hunters.
Yeah.
That was really great. I love that idea that you guys get on a train and write this book together.
That is really cool.
Yeah, so authors, people who are authors or want to be authors, they really imagine this sort of like lone creative genius sitting in a room writing away by themselves, and they don't ever think about working with other authors. Really, they don't think of it as a collaborative.
I'm jealous because ever since I was like a teenager, I had this dream of like getting a bunch of friends together and having like a party. But at the party, one person would like go into another room and start a story and come back and read it aloud, and then the next person would go and like add to the story, and then at the end of the evening, you'd have like this really cool story y'all wrote together. And probably there would be drinking involved, so you get to see how that would sort of evolve or devolve of the story went. But it's really hard to get a lot of anybody to want to write with other people, in my experience.
Well, obviously you're doing it.
Yeah, he's doing it. That's why I'm really excited to hear this.
So what is it that you love about co-writing, and why would you suggest that as an approach for authors?
I really never thought it was strange, because like I said, I wasn't like one of those kids who was like, oh, someday I'm going to dream of being an author and I'm going to sit in the woods by myself and type away on a typewriter in a log cabin and then money will just come to me.
Yeah.
Like I just never had that sort of dream. In fact, I would say I came from a different artistic expression of music.
Yes.
In that,
which is collaborative.
In music, I think the solo genius is really more of a myth. Like it's not really even encouraged all that much. They're outliers. Like there are very few people who are singularly famous as musicians.
Right.
In the world of music, especially in rock bands, the very nature is collaboration. Like that's what a band is. You get 3 or 4 or 5 people in a room together, and you got to battle it out. Like you got to come with ideas. You have to be supportive. You have to be critical. You have to lead. You have to follow. Sometimes you decide on a part with your guitar. Other times it's with a fist. Like, but like it really is a creative energy that's by its very nature is collaborative. And that is what I came to novel writing with. So to me, it felt odd to sit in a room by myself and type out a story and not share it with anyone and not ask for feedback and not to, like, and just to emerge with like, okay, here it is. What do you think? Like that felt really foreign to me. So it's hard for me to answer that question because I know like there are a lot of writers who are hardcore introverts as I am as well, but they just want to sit in a room and type. And I think that's fine. Like there's nothing wrong with that. I think where you have to really think about your process is when it comes to commercialization. Mm-hmm. So if you really love to tell stories and all you want to do is write stories and stick them in your drawer, then by all means go sit in the woods by yourself and type. Like that's awesome. Mm-hmm. But I think if you're looking for something that's going to be commercially viable, if you want people to read it, I really truly believe that storytelling is better with input. And I would even push back on those hardcore, lone wolf style writers who say I don't need anyone. Well, eventually you do. Like eventually you got to hire an editor. Yeah, right. Like, you need editors, you need cover designers, especially if you're self-publishing. If you're pursuing traditional, you need to team up with an agent or a publishing house's editor. Like you still need other people. So I think even that is a myth. But
exactly.
Even, and I'm sure, you both know from your own experience, you get too close to your own words, you get too close to your own story, and sometimes you lose the ability to objectively step back and make it better. And I think that's where having collaborative partners, whether they're co-writers or editors you've worked with a long time, or a team of writers, that's the best approach. And if you look at mass media in general, writing is the only place where that's even somewhat accepted. Like, can you imagine trying to create a movie with a single screenwriter and no other input, or a television show with a room of writers with one writer in it? Like, it just wouldn't happen.
Yeah. I know how you feel. I grew up with music as well. I grew up, piano and percussion and performing and all that stuff. So music was always so collaborative.
Right.
But I mean, even if you're a lone piano player, you need your teacher and coach, right? I mean, you need someone to help you out and to hear things that you're not hearing when you're playing it exactly.
Right.
And also, I get criticism from, I'm extremely extroverted. Like, me alone in a room forever would just be that wouldn't be my definition of like writing heaven. That's just hell. Like, I mean, I do not thrive in that environment, and I'm so much more extroverted, but I guess that's probably why I always say every business is people business. Like, there's nothing you can do at all except, I guess, be a hermit in the middle of nowhere where you're not going to need other people. Like writing, like you said, you need beta readers, you need an editor, you need someone who can make the cover, you need people who can help you distribute, you need to get the word out. Every business is people business. There's no such thing as a business that's not.
That's true.
I also wonder if maybe being in role-playing games originally, it's also
a collaboration.
Because even though you're the GM or DM, the players still contribute to that story somewhat too.
Yeah, you can't be a DM with no players.
Nope.
Can't be a band leader with no band. You're just a crazy person waving your arms. I mean, we have those, but I don't think that that's something you want to aspire to. Well, and also, we were wanting to talk about, with your fiction writing, that you focus heavily on post-apocalyptic stories, which really gets my attention. That's some of my favorite novels and stories. My whole upbringing, Fahrenheit 451, Handmaid's Tale. I loved The Handmaid's Tale years before anyone ever thought of turning that into a TV show, I can tell you that. Sort of that post-apocalyptic, well, humanity's screwed, were always my go-to favorite things to ever read. Boy, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah. So why that genre?
Yeah, so maybe you can explain a little better than I can figure out what is so appealing and what's appealing about it to you.
I think for me, it's just really pure escapism. Maybe less so over the past year, but prior to this year, I would say it's just it's escapism. It's living vicariously in a place that doesn't necessarily exist. And there's different flavors of it. Like I like zombie stories. I'm not a huge zombie fan. I like more of the contemporary post-apoc where it's human elements as opposed to supernatural ones. But even still, I think I love the fantasy element of it, and I've always been fascinated by atrophy and decay, which sounds like a really bizarre thing to say, but like, I've always been the one who would love to drive through the parts of the neighborhood where they're the abandoned buildings. Yeah. And I'm fascinated by that. Like, I want to know, how did those buildings become abandoned, and who lived in them, and what did they look like when they were originally built, and how did they get into this condition? There's a high level of curiosity that goes along with that. And for most of my life, I've lived in I grew up in Pittsburgh, and for the past 15 years, I've been living in Cleveland. And those are two Rust Belt cities. Yeah. And those are two cities that have lost a lot of population over the past 40 or 50 years. So there are parts of both of those cities where there are stretches, streets, neighborhoods that are completely abandoned. And I just find that fascinating. And I think that's what taps into that sort of post-apocalyptic setting, is like, where did everyone go and why, and what's going to happen when we're gone? Like, there's a real strong curiosity that's fueled there. And then on the other side of it, I feel like a good post-apoc story, and this is what I try and do when I'm writing them, there's got to be a glimmer of hope somewhere at the end. And so I love post-apoc stories that leave you with a sense of melancholy, but also hope. Yeah. And that's the emotion I'm trying to evoke out of readers when I write post-apoc.
Yeah. It probably is a lot of escapism. When I was very, very young, I loved more the pure fantasy type thing. Then I got a little older and it was more grounded in post-apocalyptic, So I think you're onto something there. But yeah, I think it does sort of shape I think that people who grew up in like LA or New York are going to have a very different outlook on life than like, you coming from more of the Rust Belt areas. And, where I'm from, it's sort of like where the Rust Belt meets coal country and agriculture, all three of which have been in significant decline. I was a little kid, my dad was a coal miner. He went from the coal mines to the factories. And, our family reunions went on tobacco farms. So, none of these groups are faring well in recent decades. And it does give you a slightly different outlook on life than the people who are living in these thriving metropolitan areas. But I've always found it interesting you talk about the hope, because I found people who mostly, those of us who kind of grew up in these areas like that, tend to be a bit more, not only have more grit, but a little bit more hopeful. So many people who have grew up in areas where they had it so much easier, are the least hopeful people. I don't know if it's like a muscle that never had to develop because things just went well or what. But yeah, I think that maybe it's that combination of grit, escapism, and grit and hope in a post-apocalyptic setting that perhaps we need people who are from the flyover country like all of us. Yeah.
I think we're talking sweeping generalizations, of course, but I think there's a blue collar work ethic in cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit,
right?
Chicago. There's sort of a lunch bucket mentality, like you honor your responsibilities, you punch in, you do your job, you do it well, you go home, you serve your family, and there are problems with that too. Like, I'm not glorifying that, but I think there is a sort of built-in grit there. Like when I was growing up in Pittsburgh in the 70s. I tell the story, people can't believe it. Like, my grandfather worked in the mills, and they lived on a ridge above the mills, and they would have been considered upper middle class at the time, but they didn't have much. And what they did have was like a 16-foot above ground pool in their backyard.
Ooh.
And every day, my grandfather in the summer or one of my uncles would have to go out and sweep the pool because there would be a coating of black soot on the bottom from the mills.
Yeah.
And that was every single day. So I think there's, and there are people that grow up in that environment. Like, that's what it was. Pittsburgh in the 70s was a gritty, dirty, stinky place. And I think to survive in an environment like that, like, you got to have grit, and it gets built into generations, and it gets into your DNA. So, luckily, most of my work is done behind a keyboard, but I have that running through my blood, and I've kind of adopted that blue collar work ethic when it comes to everything that I do.
And the work ethic will serve you well in anything, whether it's a blue collar job or especially writing, because you have to be so persistent and resilient writing.
And you'll survive a zombie apocalypse with a blue-collar work ethic, too.
You really will. But, I think that's something that's very much overlooked. I know there's this amazing, amazing artist. Her name's Myra Sheeter. She's got artwork that's hanging all over the world in embassies and, just like high-end, people pay, $250,000 for a painting. And she lives nearby, close to my hometown. And every morning, Monday through Friday, she gets up, she has breakfast, she goes into her studio in her home at 8, comes out at noon, has an hour lunch, goes back into her studio until about 5, does that at least 5 days a week. And it's like punching a time card. She's like, if I sat around and waited for inspiration to strike, I'd never get anything done. It's a job. I just go. And she's this incredibly gifted artist and, celebrated in these big circles in Manhattan and all this stuff. But she lives in a small town in Indiana, and boy, she approaches it like a job. That's how she was raised, And if she didn't have that kind of grit and that stick-to-itiveness and that work ethic like that you have, you just really wouldn't get much done.
Right.
Why don't you tell our audiences if they're wondering, oh boy, I wonder what post-apocalyptic stories you have.
Yes, please tell us some.
Can you tell them about a couple of the series you have going?
Yeah. So the biggest series I co-wrote with Glenn James called Dustfall. It's a world I love. It's a post-apoc story, but it's set a few hundred years into the future. So a lot of our modern conveniences and a lot of the remnants of our modern society are these cultural artifacts that the people of that time find bizarre. So that was a world that we really loved to create. I think we got 5 books in that series. Zach and I have done a couple with different flavors. So we have The Final Awakening, which is sort of like a vampire apocalypse style story. We have War for Earth, which is an alien invasion post-apoc story.
Yes.
We have the Baron series, which is sort of it's not cli-fi exactly, but it's definitely sort of a climate-induced apocalypse. So there's that story. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we've created these different variations and different types of apocalyptic stories, I guess.
Awesome.
The alien apocalypse stories to me are like the scariest. That is so cool. I mean, just the thought that this like almost godlike technology coming out of the sky. What the hell are we gonna do?
Exactly.
Out of curiosity, with us being in a soft apocalypse.
This is slow rolling. It's like a slow rolling apocalypse. You see it coming, but it's in slow motion.
Have you noticed, any changes? Like, are there more people reading books right now, or is it pretty much the same? Or have you seen any changes in your sale numbers? I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I think most people are just providing anecdotal evidence to that. Some people say, oh, their book sales are way up, and others will say, oh, my book sales are way down. I think my fiction sales have been pretty consistent. They really haven't changed all that much. I wish I could say like they've gone up. I have heard some people say like, well, I don't want to read post-apoc now because it's just too real, because it's too close to what's happening. But I don't think that's not causation.
Yeah.
I think it might be correlation. There might be some people who think that, but I don't necessarily see that in any sort of, evidentiary way that would convince me that it's happening on a wide scale.
Yeah, I've heard, people saying that, and
I have gone
some
towards
agents,
lighter fare, I guess, lately.
Yeah, and some agents being, not wanting to accept stories like that, and I'm kind of like, I don't know, is that really true? Because I remember, I feel like
I think there's always going to be a market for everything.
Well, even like World War II, comic books had a lot of World War II stories. Sometimes I think as long as you have hope in there, it could be kind of nice to take a scenario that's happening, but then see hope and see people working through it too, maybe. I don't know.
I don't want to completely bum them out, I guess, but still.
Well, one of my favorite story gurus is Brian McDonald, and he often says it's the sole reason for storytelling is survival. It's a survival mechanism. Mm-hmm. So, back in the caveman times or times of dinosaurs, people would tell stories about the saber-toothed tiger that was lurking around the bush so that no one else got eaten, right? And that's sort of where this whole idea of storytelling came from. So I think if you look at it through that lens, then, people who really love post-apocalyptic stories now are using them as a survival mechanism, because we're obviously not in an EMP or a zombie apocalypse yet, but we are in a situation where you can learn from those. How do you deal with the isolation? How do you deal with the lack of resources? How do you deal with misinformation? These are all themes that run through post-apocalyptic books. And so if you're reading those now, some people might be reading those as a means to survival. So that's why I don't necessarily buy the argument that, well, people aren't going to read it because it's too close. I think it could be the opposite could be true. I think people could be reading those looking for answers.
I think it's kind of in our DNA to almost want to be scared sometimes too. I mean, little kids they're like, oh, they'll scream and then do it again, and I, some of these fairy tales that we tell that have been passed to kids for centuries are disturbing and scary. And I think like what you said there about the scary saber-tooth, I think that a lot of stories were told at night around a campfire about the scary things that are out there in the shadows and at night. And it was a good scare, and it was entertaining, but it also provided information. It was teaching, and it might have scared them, and they kind of enjoyed it, but it was a big scare. But they also were thinking, oh, this is what I do the next time I run into whatever, You know,
Exactly.
and so I think that storytelling just in general is just in human DNA. I mean, you either want to tell stories or you want to hear stories, consume stories somehow. Yeah. And scary, you know, the scary and the post-apocalyptic and the, oh gosh, what would I do in that situation? I think we're just really pre-programmed to think that way, honestly.
So, if people couldn't figure it out by now, you're an indie author. And so we've had people on who are indie authors, people who are traditionally published, people who are a hybrid. What is it about being an indie author that drew you down that path versus trying to, the whole querying at agents and trying to be traditionally published? And is traditionally publishing ever something you would ever, you know, be open to at some point for a project?
Yeah, well, I'm not a flag-waving indie author. In fact, I rarely even discuss it. It's because I don't see competing camps. I don't see sort of a mutual exclusivity there. I look at it as a project-by-project basis. What is the best thing I can do for this project? And so far, it's been to self-publish it. I'm not the writer who says, well, you know, screw traditional publishing. Like, I'm doing it my way. Like, I think there are benefits and drawbacks to both. So I'm currently right now, I'm finishing up a manuscript I've been working on for a year, and my goal is to query agents with it. And I want to see if I can get it traditionally published. And when I met JD at Thriller Fest, I was doing Pitch Fest. I went in and I pitched a novel, a manuscript to 15 different agents. So I think, you know, for me, I don't want to limit any options that I have. You know, there are great advantages, and you can Google on the internet. There's a ton of info out there. You know, there's great advantages to being an indie, and there are advantages to being traditionally published. So I like to remind people that there's two things I like to remind writers when I have this conversation. The first one is you don't have to be an indie writer or a traditional writer. You look at it at a book by book decision. Mm-hmm. Like you can be a hybrid. Like there's nothing wrong with that. The second thing, which I think gets lost in it a lot, is people think that they can choose to be an indie writer or a traditionally published writer. You can't choose that. You can choose to self-publish, and that will make you an indie, or you can choose to pursue traditional publishing. Mm-hmm. But there is no, like, it's not like an option. Like, you know, we know what the numbers are. You know, the small percentage of slush piles that find their way into an agent who then represents a writer, and then the small percentage of those manuscripts that get sold to a traditional publisher. Like it's really, really hard. And when people talk about it as a choice, I don't think that's an honest evaluation of the situation. You can choose to self-publish or choose to pursue traditional publishing, but you can't choose traditionally publishing.
Mm-hmm.
It's true.
That's true. I know. I kind of dig the entrepreneurial vibe of the traditional path, you know.
I do, but I can understand it's not for every writer.
No. Well, I mean, there's no such thing as something that's right for everybody.
No. Otherwise, we'd have one religion, not a million different kinds.
Well, and like I said, you know, it's a project by project basis too. Like, you know, I look at something like The Final Awakening. Like that's the best-selling fiction series that I've written, and it, you know, Zach and I, we just checked. We had a book bub on that, the box set for that series, and we double checked our page reads. It's been in Kindle Unlimited since we launched it 3 years ago. Yeah, 3 years ago. And we have 3.7 million page reads on that series.
Sweet.
Which is phenomenal, and we're really pleased with that. And yet that series would never have been touched by an agent or a traditional publisher because it's just not what they're looking for. Mm-hmm. So again, it goes to this idea that, like, you know, there's one isn't better than the other. It's just you have to think about the project that you're working on. What's that better suited for? Mm-hmm. And the manuscript I'm working on right now that I want to query agents with is more of a mainstream sort of horror, dark thriller standalone. And you know, and I think that's much better suited to what agents are looking for now versus some other style or genre.
Mm-hmm.
True.
I notice you gravitate towards series. Do you feel like that works well for authors to do series versus standalone as an indie?
I love series.
It depends on genre. You know, I think if you're writing horror, it's really hard to write horror in a series. Like I've tried it. It hasn't worked for me. I haven't seen it work for too many people.
A romantic comedy would be hard, I think, to do more a series or something.
Exactly. Then you look at the other side of it. You know, if you're looking at something like space opera, sci-fi, or any kind of romance, like that's where you got to write in a series, because those are voracious readers, and they will read through the whole thing. So I don't think it's necessarily an author decision as much as it is a genre decision.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. Now, I remember I didn't get a chance to partake in it because I was about to graduate and I got sidetracked. But I remember you emailing about that you're going to write one short story every month this year.
How's that going?
Yeah, have you been doing that, and how's that been going?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I'm into a groove now. I have a routine. I have time set aside. It's a challenge. I think it's a little harder than I thought, but it's a good kind of challenge. It's forcing me to not be precious with ideas. It's forcing me to create something and move on, which is good. I think I have a lot of tendency to go back and tinker with stuff, and that's not always the best approach. So yeah, we're approaching the beginning of April here, and I'm about 3 or 4 stories ahead so far, and I have no reason to believe that I won't write 52 this year.
Awesome.
Great.
Oh, so is it one every week, not every month? Is that what it is?
One every week.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
He was telling me month. That's hard enough. One every week.
Ooh,
wow.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Good for you.
That's good. Yeah, I know. In the MFA program, so we do these workshops at every term, and some people would use their thesis and they would just keep using that. But I was like, you know what? It seems silly to give somebody
the middle, a chunk in the middle with no context
no
at
context.
all.
I don't know how useful that is. So I was like, I'm going to write a short story each time. And I'm going to try to do a different genre every time.
He did too.
And that was I think that really made me fleshed me out as a writer, I think.
It also confused the hell out of your professors.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they couldn't label me in a box. I was like,
they were like, what are you doing? Last one was hard. Fooled ya.
Now it's a comedy. So, but yeah, I would suggest that. It sounds like it's working for you too. I would suggest that for a lot of writers is just try to do different short stories.
Because it's hard when you first start out. It can be hard to think of creative ideas. The more you do it, it's not like you're going to run out of them. I used them all up. The more you start thinking about it, then the more you get.
Yeah.
And the better they get.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was the same way whenever I first started writing. I was like, oh, these ideas are precious and they will run out. What would I ever do? But the more...
Turns out you just get more.
Yeah. The more you create, the more you get, yeah.
Yep.
Whenever you use something like the 3-story method for writing a story, how do you tweak that? A short story, structure-wise, and of course size-wise is very different than a novel. How are you kind of approaching that method?
Yeah, I just use the scene template really from the worksheet, and that you can get from the website. Mm-hmm. And it's a much smaller scale, obviously. And really for short stories, I focus mostly just on the 3 C's, because you don't have a lot of real estate to world build. You're not doing deep characterization. You're really developing just a single piece of entertainment that needs to be quick and efficient, and you need to get right into it. So for short stories, mostly just focusing on the 3 C's will get me going. So when I sit down to write a short story, before I do that, I'll have a bullet point for each of those 3 C's, and that's all I have, and that's what I'll use to then write the story.
Oh, very cool.
Have any of these short stories that you've written, after you get done, you're like, I think I'd rather stick with this and flesh that out into a novel or a series? There
have been, and the struggle I have is that what I want to do is not necessarily what readers want, and I have to constantly remind myself of that. I've been so guilty of building things as an entrepreneur, or writing things that I really think is cool and no one else does, and that's fine. Like I said, that's fine if you're not trying to make a living at it. But if you are, you're going to go broke if you do that. So what I'm trying to do now is be much more aware of what the audience wants. So one of the things that I built into the short story project is anyone who purchased that option from my list, they get the ability at the end of every short story to rate it, and it's the same rating form every time. Mm-hmm. So what I'm going to do at the end of the year is I'm going to go back and I'm going to look and see, okay, what were my highest rated stories and what did people say about those? Because my intention was having 52 different short stories. I can take any one of those and create a novel or a series around it. But I'm only going to do that for the ones that really connected with the readers.
Oh, that's smart.
So Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it works. I'm resisting the temptation to look at those ratings on a week-to-week basis because I don't want it to affect what I'm writing or how I'm writing. But I think at the end, I will have some good input from readers that will tell me, which one of those kernels might be worth exploring some more.
You have so much more self-control than I have. I be checking that baby every day.
Yeah, I really love that. It's like TV pilot season. And
it is.
Picked up. It's pretty awesome. Yep. All right.
And sometimes they're very surprised in which TV pilots get the response and which ones don't too.
True.
That's right. I'm wrong 100% of the time. 100% of the time when I'm writing something, I think, oh, this is going to go really well, and it doesn't, or I think this isn't that great, and then people love it. So
what you're saying is yourself are not part of your own core audience.
I mean, I think I am, but I don't. It's a lesson I've had to learn. It's like, no, I am not the reader. It's sort of a lesson in humility. It's hard to grapple with.
Yeah.
You want to think you are the reader, but a lot of times you're not. Sometimes you are, but I'm not.
Yeah, it's a lesson in humility too, I imagine. It's like, well, I thought I had that figured out. Oops.
Well, the more you do it, the less precious you are about it. I'm I don't know, 20 or 30 novels in at this point, and they're just products to me. I love them, and I put everything into them, and once it's done, it's done. And great, if it does well, great. If it doesn't, I got more words. I'll just write another one.
Yep. You're always moving forward.
Yeah, I think you have to be.
Yep. And if they want clown cowboy riding unicorn story to be a novel series, you go for it.
Yeah, I mean, if
I want that.
If you write something like that and you enjoy it and readers like it, then you should double down on it.
Yeah. Now I want that.
You want that?
I don't understand why people don't like clowns. I come from a family of clowns. We even went to my dad's clown school graduation together. And I had an uncle when I was growing up, an aunt and uncle who were clowns. I thought it was cool.
A little creepy sometimes.
Well, I mean, I didn't mean my family. I meant clowns in general. My family's creepy, but the clowns aren't. You gotta be specific here.
Well, we've had a great time chatting with you, Jay. It's been really awesome to finally get to speak to you.
Oh, yeah.
Before we go, can you tell our audience where they can find you and your work online?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was a good time. The easiest thing to do is go to theauthorlife.com. That's theauthorlife.com. And from there, you can get to everything I do. Fiction, nonfiction, podcasts, story rubrics. It's all there.
Oh, that's a good way to put it all in together.
Well, one spot. Yeah, one place to go.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Hi, I'm Dean Wesley Smith, USA Today best-selling writer of well over 100 novels and 17 million copies in print. And you are listening to Genre-tainment.
Well, thanks for being on the show, Jay.
Check out the show notes for links that we mentioned in the interview.
Now, before we go, we want to give a shout out to the full band duo McCarty, who created our new theme music for Genre-tainment. And you can find links to their YouTube channel in our show notes. Well, that's it for today's Genre-tainment. Until next time. Genre-tainment.
And we got the promos on there.
Genre-tainment.
Is that our new theme song?
Yes.
I think we'll stick with the current one.
Doesn't sound professional.
No.
Well, poop.
But I'm going to put this in the...
I didn't know you. Well, poop. Bad monkey.